Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. If I can have the presentation. What I'm going to do is focus on the low middle income countries and the problems that those countries face. In this meeting, we've had very interesting discussions with extremely useful insights. As a doer, I'm concerned about how are we going to implement all these things that we discuss. It will be a fruitless exercise if we spend all this time with, but we don't implement things. So there are a few problems facing this area generally and facing low middle income countries particularly. Firstly, we seem to want to tackle a large number of problems. And when you tackle too many things, you don't do anything. And so we need to have a focused approach where we look at achievable incomes that can be achieved within a short frame rather than over a 20-year to 30-year period that politicians like to talk about. And unfortunately, the problem with cancer is that it's become a political issue. It's a useful tool in political rallies. And so a lot of problems are made. So way back in 1971, we had a claim that we have a war on cancer. We will beat cancer in 10 years. 50 years later, we're still trying to beat cancer. As recently as 2019, another presidential candidate said that if I'm elected, you're going to see the single most important change in America. We're going to cure cancer. Then 2 weeks later, his rival said, and I'm no prizes for guessing who said it, is, if I'm elected, we will come up with cures to many, many problems, to many, many diseases, including cancers, and we're getting closer all the time. So these are all rhetoric, and we need to move beyond that. And the unfortunate thing is that these types of slogans are also picked up by politicians in Africa and other countries. Not specifically to cancer, but we are going to address all the health problems. We can eradicate malaria, we can eradicate, and none of those things actually materialize. And so one of the things we need to do is focus on achieving problems or addressing problems that can be resolved within our lifetimes. And the second point is that now that we have comprehensive cancer being successfully implemented in Europe, from the experience gained and the teething problems experienced in setting up these comprehensive cancer centers, I think it's important to use the lessons learned, to import those lessons and work on establishing these comprehensive cancer centers in low and middle income countries. In most of the low income countries and middle income countries, patients are generally located very far from the treatment centers in rural areas. Very often they have to endure something like an 8-hour bus ride to the nearest treatment center. And because of that fact, a lot of patients are lost to follow-up. So they don't come back for second treatment, they don't come back for consultations, and very often there is no contact details to contact the patient. And so these comprehensive cancer centers should also have, therefore, facilities to house patients while they are undergoing treatment to make sure that they're not lost to follow-up treatments. Sometimes the treatment could be for 6 to 8 weeks, and accommodating for that 6 to 8 weeks would be a very useful thing to do. Thirdly, and this is one of the things that I always bring up, and one of the big gripes I have, is that low and middle income countries need to take ownership um, by increasing expenditure on research and development, and in this case, especially for comprehensive cancer centers. Um, Very often, African countries get gifts from rich nations, but these gifts come with very long and very tough strings. They don't come for free. And anything given for free is not appreciated. So countries need to invest to show commitment and that they're committed to achieving those goals set up by the comprehensive cancer centers. Unfortunately, very often funding agencies look at what are attractive, what is attractive, and what achieve a lot of attention. So diseases like HIV/AIDS and TB are very sexy diseases to study. And so those are the focus areas, and non-communicable diseases are neglected because they're not in the limelight. And if you look at the continent like Africa, more people die of diabetes and obesity-related diseases due to cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, high blood pressure, and other complications leading from there than people dying from HIV, TB, malaria combined. But yet those diseases are neglected. So we need to get our priorities right so that we focus on all the diseases, and non-communicable diseases are on much more rapidly. So global non-communicable diseases are doing that, whereas infectious diseases are more or less leveling out. But we're not changing our priorities in this field. The other important area is that big pharma-driven drug trials is also a somewhat of a trap. In most of the developing countries, these drug trials are used in an exploitative manner by the big pharma, by enumerating doctors who participate in these trials based on the number of patients that they can recruit into the trial. And very often, the work is done very shoddily and not with the greatest care and dedication. Some institutions, such as my university, have introduced very strict ethical guidelines on clinical drug trials funded by pharmaceutical companies. And what the companies have simply done is move to other institutions that are not as strict and other countries where they're not as strict. So they simply just move around and they circumvent any obstacles that are placed in the way. And so we need, as was highlighted many times during this meeting, that we need to look at non-commercial entity funded research. The next major problem, also mentioned earlier by Professor Dosanjh, is that equipment in African countries are very expensive. They not the latest models usually that are available. And usually they come with very expensive maintenance contracts that are not, that the countries are not able to service. So that in many of the African countries, there are no experienced technicians to maintain and service the equipment. And so very often technicians are flown in from other countries at great cost. Fortunately for South Africa, that's not the problem, but the technicians are flown from South Africa to other African countries to service and maintain equipment. And so that is also another problem. And I thought I'll mention it in case people come up with ideas about how to address these problems. Now, the way forward, we need, I opened this discussion by saying how we're going to address the problem, and I'm hoping to make some suggestions about the way forward. We need intervention by a broad coalition of non-political, neutral, but respected partners, such as this academy and probably other academies, to drive the process, maybe setting up CCCs, and also to talk to governments about setting up in their countries these clinical centers. And I think, as suggested by my colleague here, that we need to roll out the concept of comprehensive cancer centers globally. I think it should be rolled out to low and middle income countries as a priority, because that's where it's needed and that's where the vacuum exists. And maybe the groundwork could be done if the EU was persuaded to have a call for the establishment, for submission of proposals for the establishment of sub-centers, not to establish the centers, but to do all the groundwork towards such centers. We also need a strong research focus, including translational research, to provide up-to-date cancer treatment. Translational, people have said translational research is a problem. It's not fully implemented in Europe. Well, in low and middle income countries in Africa, it's not implemented at all. So we need to make a start to address those problems. And lastly, diagnostic tests in rural areas. Very often patients have to come into cities for diagnostic tests, which if these can be done very cheaply in mobile clinics in the rural setting, that would be an advantage. And so these are just some of the things that I thought we can explore in alleviating the problem in low and middle income countries and in Africa specifically. Thank you.